Thank you very much. So apologies in advance. I have a bit of a chest infection, so sorry if I sound a bit weird. It sounds worse than it is. So I'd just like to start off by acknowledging our funders, and this talk nicely follows on from a lot of what Jane was talking about. So this study was supported by the NIHR HTA programme. And I'd also like to acknowledge the huge team that makes up Bluebelle. So this is just a proportion of the team you can see here. But as Jane mentioned, this was a real collaboration between methodologists, surgeons, trainees, nurses, trials units, and you'll be able to see that in the acknowledgement slide at the end. So you've probably worked out that Bluebelle is not about pretty flowers. It's actually it was a feasibility study looking at would it be possible to randomise patients to either having a dressing, not having a dressing, or having a third strategy, which I'll go on to in a second. But the focus here was on wounds that were healing by primary intention. So the name for the study, there's a bit of a backstory here, which I won't go into detail today, but this young girl is called Bluebelle, and she was part of the inspiration for applying for funding for this RCT. So if you're interested, I can tell you what happened during the break. So Bluebelle was, as I mentioned, funded by the HTA. It was a commissioned call for research. And this is just part of the blurb for that commissioned brief. So they mention here that current studies are not adequate to show convincing differences about whether complex and costly dressings are more cost effective than simple and inexpensive dressings or no dressings. So in this brief, they had acknowledged a Cochrane review that had been published by Joe Dunville and colleagues. And the findings of this review were that we need better quality research, looking at do dressings really prevent surgical site infection in wounds healing by primary intention. You'll see that this brief has specifically mentioned complex dressings, simple dressings, and no dressings. And they also went on to talk about the uncertainties of whether a trial of this nature was feasible. So this was a course specifically for feasibility studies. So in alignment with that, that's exactly what we propose to do. So our aim was to work out, is it possible to conduct this future main RCT, comparing these three different dressing strategies, we'll call them, and the primary outcome for such a trial would be presence of surgical site infection 30 days after that index operation. But so we propose to answer this question by conducting a pilot version of that future intended RCT. So that's, in essence, a dummy run version of the future trial. So it wouldn't be powered to answer our question, but it would help us work out if the components of that trial can work together. We also had a pre-pilot stage, which we've called Phase A here, and that consisted of lots of qualitative research to explore current wound dressing practices and healthcare professional and patients' views on the acceptability of the proposed trial. And the idea was that those findings would help us to fine-tune the pilot for the proposed pilot RCT. But actually, that pre-trial work turned out to be really, really crucial and transformative, actually. So what we found that even though this is what we intended to deliver as the pilot, this actually didn't align very well with current NHS practice in the management of primary wounds. So we had to make some adaptations to make it more relevant. And again, I won't go into detail today, but happy to talk through it during the break. What we found was that complex dressings tend not to be used in the kinds of wounds we were interested in. What did seem to be used, though, was this idea of using glue or tissue adhesive as a dressing. So as I'm sure I don't need to explain to this room, but tissue glue is normally used to close wounds, so like sutures. But through the interviews, we started to realise that some surgeons were using glue over the top of an already closed wound, so forming a seal, and in that sense it was almost functioning as a dressing. So we confirmed all this through some survey work that we conducted. It wasn't planned, but we realised we needed to do this on the basis of the qualitative insights. And we then derived quite clear evidence that this is the relevant question that we need to answer. In addition to that, we also realised that it's not really sufficient to just look at surgical site infection rates. So patients in particular were talking about potential other benefits of dressings. So things like management of wound leakage, the comfort around the wound during the healing process, or the psychological benefits of not being able to see the wound. So we realised we need to somehow capture these issues as well. So we developed some tools in that phase A period to try and capture some of this information in the pilot trial. So all of that has been published and written up, and you can read more about that phase A study here and exactly how it transformed the pilot plans. So onwards to the actual pilot RCT. So now we were looking at, can we deliver this RCT comparing simple dressings, glue as a dressing, and no dressings? And importantly, if so, how can we deliver it well? And if it's not possible, then why not? So those how and why questions are really best answered through embedded qualitative research, and that's really important in feasibility studies. So I'm going to talk through a series of uncertainties that we addressed during the pilot RCT, and I'll go through each of these in turn, starting with recruitment. Before I get to that, I'll just a quick slide on the patient population and the settings that we conducted the pilot in. So it was conducted across 5 UK NHS hospitals, spanning 4 different NHS trusts. And I won't go into detail about the inclusion and exclusion criteria, but in a nutshell, we were looking for adults who'd had either general surgery or obstetric surgery with a skin incision, and they had a wound, a primary wound. And they needed to be adults, as I've mentioned there. And a kind of a key exclusion criterion was for any patients where the intention was to close the wound with glue. We excluded those because obviously that was one of our dressing strategies we were investigating. So uncertainties around recruitment. We had 2 questions really. Would patients be willing to be randomised to such a trial? We did some pre-trial qualitative hypothetical work, but that's really no substitute for really capturing patients' reactions when they're actually faced with this question. And there were also uncertainties around would surgeons be, and nurses actually, be willing to put their patients forwards for this RCT, or how easy would it be for surgeons to deviate from their current practices? Would they really be happy to not put a dressing on at the end of an operation? Or indeed use glue if that's not something they would usually do. So our first objective was to establish the numbers of potentially eligible patients, the proportion of those that were actually confirmed as eligible, then the proportion recruited and randomised. And like with any feasibility study, you have to set your targets of what you think you need to achieve to deem the study feasible. And the target for recruitment was 330 patients, based on a conversion rate of 36%. So what actually happened? We screened over 1,000 patients. Of those, most of them were confirmed as eligible, and a good proportion of them were actually approached about the RCT. So one thing I didn't mention was that we did this in unplanned and unelective care. So as Jane mentioned earlier, actually capturing those patients was really important, and I'll explain later on that there were a few strategies we used to really help us approach as many patients as we possibly could. Of the patients approached, over half of them consented to participate in the RCT, and of those, the vast majority went on to actually be randomised. A few fell through the net due to logistical reasons. So this was our target, and we achieved this. So 415 patients were recruited. Looking at the conversion rates, this represented 44% of the eligible patients and 59% of the eligible and approached patients. So we were quite reassured about recruitment. We did try and explore patients' reactions to the RCT. So this quote is fairly representative of what a lot of the patients were saying. So this patient said, I thought, well, this is such minor stuff compared with what I'm actually going to have to go through. They were talking about their operation. I'm quite happy to help. And a lot of patients said this. There were some exceptions. So this patient was talking about the prospect of being randomized to no dressing. So they said, I think you feel a little bit anxious that maybe the dressing will stop your wound from separating or something like that. That was quite common, actually. It was interesting. But the staff were great. They really reassured that everything would be fine, and should anything happen, they could easily pop a dressing on. So just reassuring this patient that their clinical needs would always supersede the needs of the trial was sufficient to reassure them about going into the RCT. So we were satisfied with recruitment. The next question was, would it be possible to conduct randomization in theatre? So any good clinical trial guidebook will tell you that it's ideally we should be randomizing as close to intervention delivery as possible. So in Bluebelle, this would mean randomizing in theatre, specifically, ideally, just after the point of wound closure, because that's when a dressing would normally be applied, applied or not. But there were questions about, can we really do this in a busy theatre setting where, it's often an unpredictable environment? And, there were questions raised as why can't you just randomise in advance or at the beginning of the operation? And that would be easier in many ways, but this issue of performance bias just made us think maybe we should try to randomise after wound closure if we possibly can. So this is based on some insights from the pre-trial qualitative research and just knowledge within our team, really, that there is a chance that if surgeons knew their patients, for example, were allocated to no dressing, that might influence how they close the wound. They might take a bit more care closing the wound, and that in theory could then influence SSI rates. So we didn't know if this was a thing. So we proposed to do some methodological work, which hadn't been planned. Unfortunately, we couldn't complete this, but the idea was to randomise to disclosing the dressing allocation before wound closure, so at some point in the beginning of the operation, or disclosing the allocation after wound closure. And what we wanted to look at then was the quality of the wound closure. So we had to develop some metrics to assess wound closure quality, and that's the bit that took a lot of time and unfortunately meant we couldn't complete this. But it is something that we're still working on in the background. However, what we were able to answer this question of is it possible to randomise in theatre? And the answer there is absolutely yes. So all 394 patients randomised in Bluebelle, that randomisation happened in the theatre setting. And the half that, where the randomisation was disclosed after wound closure, that generally went pretty well actually. So based on the qualitative interviews, there were some kind of hiccups. It really required a real coordinated team approach. So that's why we're not entirely sure how feasible it would be if we rolled it out on a kind of grander scale, because we had quite committed centres in our pilot. So, right, so the third area of uncertainty related to adherence. So first of all, will theatre staff actually allocate or deliver the allocated dressing strategy? So if it was no dressing, would the patient actually leave theatre without a dressing on their wound, for example? And if so, what about the post-surgical recovery period? So as I'm sure you know, many healthcare professionals will come into contact with that patient. And in particular, there was concern around, say, banking nurses who maybe wouldn't be aware that the patient is part of a trial and might helpfully pop a dressing on if they see an exposed wound. So we were really quite concerned about this, actually, and we pre-specified that if adherence was less than 70% in any of those dressing strategy groups, we would then conclude that randomisation to that dressing strategy wouldn't be feasible. But encouragingly, actually, adherence was pretty good. So it was excellent when patients left theatre. Almost all patients actually left with their allocated dressing strategy. And it continued to be pretty good until study exit. So 86% of patients remained in their allocated group. And you can see there that looking at the specific dressing strategies, they were all above 70%. So the lowest there was 85% for the no dressing group, but that's still quite good. So 85% of patients allocated to no dressing didn't have a dressing applied throughout their post-surgical recovery period. And we tried a number of strategies to help us achieve this good adherence. So the most fun aspect of Bluebelle, I think, was using temporary skin transfers with the patients allocated dressing. These were basically temporary tattoos that we developed. And the nurses actually reported this added a fun element to the study, and it was acceptable to patients. Not everyone felt this was necessary, so teams that were quite close-knit felt, well, we don't need the tattoos really. We know, where the Bluebelle patients are and so on. But we used a number of other strategies as well, so laminated bed cards, stickers and notes, and so on. And finally, there's no point in doing a trial if you can't collect the data that you need. And we had a number of data collection points throughout the pilot, but I'd just like to draw your attention to this critical period at the end here between week 4 and 8. So as the primary outcome for the future trial was hopefully going to be SSI rates, we knew that we needed to develop a measure of capturing that once patients had been discharged from hospital. So this was likely to be, the future trial was likely to be very large, so we predicted over 10,000 patients would be needed. So you couldn't possibly, it wouldn't be feasible to assess SSI by bringing all those patients back to hospital or conducting home visits. So a key component of Bluebelle was, I'm sure many of you have heard of Rhiannon Macefield and her research. She was actually here yesterday and she's part of the REN network. So her PhD focused on developing a tool for capturing SSI that could be completed by patients at home or by healthcare professionals over the phone. So really the feasibility of Bluebelle hinged on, could we develop this tool and validate it? So part of the pilot looked at completion rates for those questionnaires, and you can see that there was some room for improvement. So here the participant completed questionnaire for SSI was a little bit lower than we would have liked, and likewise the health status questionnaire there's definitely room to improve those figures. But happily that tool has now been validated and it's been published, so we know that we could use that in a future RCT. But of course we would need to put determined concerted effort into improving retention and those completion rates. That wasn't a focus of the pilot study during Bluebelle, but we know we'll need to focus on that in the future. And final slide about patient acceptability. So the final bit of the qualitative research really was asking patients how was it being in the 3 different dressing strategy groups, so in particular the no dressing and glue as a dressing. And the interviews were fairly uneventful actually, which was a good thing. So patients had very little to report. They forgot about their wounds. There were no major issues they came across. Some talked about appreciating the freedom of no dressing or having glue as a dressing. There were wound complications in all 3 groups, but importantly, patients didn't attribute that to their dressing allocation strategy. Healthcare professionals had explained that these complications would have occurred irrespective of their dressing strategy. And interestingly, there were some questions around management of glue as a dressing. So one woman's quote sticks in my mind where she talked about wrapping her torso in cling film because she wasn't sure if she could get the glue wet in the shower. Brilliant. So we need to work on information provision in the future. So is an RCT of simple dressings versus glue versus no dressing possible? Yes. It's feasible and acceptable to patients and healthcare professionals. We'll need to employ the strategies we've learnt about during the feasibility study, and concerted effort will need to be expended into optimising retention. Sorry.